Hi, I'm Gabi. This is our presentation on A Catcher in the Rye and Death of a Salesman, and I'll be addressing how both Willie and Holden face psychological limitations within themselves rather than externally sourced boundaries, and how the respective authors, Arthur Miller and J.D. Salinger, use different literary techniques in order to communicate that. So, A Catcher in the Rye is chronicles a 16-year-old boy named Holden Caulfield after his expulsion from his high school, Pensy Prep, and follows him as he grapples with feelings of alienation, the loss of innocence, disillusionment with the adult world. This is marked by trauma and introspection for meaning. The novel is told through a first-person perspective and gives us, as the audience, a unique insight into how Holden navigates his coming of age. J.D. Salinger uses this avenue of narration as a literary device to provide direct insight into Holden's mental state as the reader follows him throughout the text. Similarly, in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, we follow Willie Loman, an aging salesman who confronts the collapse of his professional dreams and his personal identity, and we see him unravel throughout the narrative. And although this text is not told through a first-person perspective, Miller uses different techniques within the novel or within the play, such as flashbacks and memories, hallucinations, and fragmented dialogue throughout the text to give the audience access into Willie's inner consciousness as he reckons with his failures as a father and a man, and what he does in order to come to terms with that. So ultimately, Willie's introspection is deeply flawed because it's filtered through denial and how he wishes to be perceived and how he wants to perceive the peaks of his career and his personal life, rather than legitimately confronting his limitations, his declining career, his financial instability, his strained family relationships. He retreats into these idealized memories that allow him to have a false sense of success, almost so he can attribute meaning into important parts of his life. So he can kind of deny that his life wasn't completely a waste, like he believes it to be ultimately deep down. A quote that evidences this is found on page 14 in Act 1, and it states, I'm the New England man, I'm vital in New England. And this assertion kind of underscores how, like, Willie is really hyper focused on self-mythologizing. He really wants people to perceive him in a certain way, so far to the point where he perceives himself that way. His introspection doesn't lead to growth, but reinforces his delusion. It emphasizes his inability to accept the reality of his situation, and Miller uses this to kind of critique how Willie's internal narrative kind of traps him rather than liberates him. And he maintains this throughout the novel, but he has brief moments of legitimate introspection where he really recognizes his lived experiences for what they are. This is evidenced on page 123 in Act 1, where he states, I am not a dime a dozen. I am Willie Loman. So here we can see that he momentarily recognizes this desperation that he has to matter. The repetition within the sentence and the exclamatory tone reflect a man who's confronting his real limitations, but he's like ultimately unable to reconcile them, reinforcing the tragic nature of his introspection. And ultimately, he only holds in high regard the memories in which he is seen the way that he wants to be seen, the way where he's a successful businessman, where he's a good family man. He doesn't recognize these moments as real, as his legitimately lived experiences throughout the novel. So ultimately, we see that Arthur Miller uses these flashbacks, fragmented pieces of dialogue, in order to critique Willie Loman, to offer some contrast between reality and what Willie Loman perceives to be his reality. We see this evidenced with these quotes, how he believes himself to be one version of a man where his family, his coworkers, everyone who lives with him and has to interact with him doesn't see him in that manner. And that heavily contrasts with Catcher in the Rye and the way that J.D. Salinger uses introspection and first-person narration to document Holden's self-awareness. I think his self-awareness is intertwined with his emotional paralysis throughout the novel. He's very well aware of his mental state and how he's spiraling, and he acknowledges throughout the story as the reader follows him in New York. Although his self-awareness does not directly translate into action, he recognizes that he has flaws and that he remains emotionally stuck, but he has an inability to process his grief about his brother and his ultimate transition into adulthood as a 16-year-old boy. A quote that exemplifies this is, quote, "I'm the most terrific liar you ever saw in your life," and it's found on page 22. And unlike Willie, Holden openly admits his limitations, and this honesty suggests an inherent awareness about where he is currently. However, his casual tone kind of makes the admission more trivial. It makes it something that he doesn't regard as serious, and it kind of indicates avoidance rather than a legitimate solution that he's looking for. Salinger presents this introspection as sort of a double-edged sword. It reveals truth without any solution or clarity for Holden Caulfield. And this first person narration really allows for the reader to connect with Holden Caulfield and to truly see how he is struggling with his mental health. And it allows us to gain like a new perspective on the way that he's navigating coming of age. His fixation on innocence reflects his fear of change and emotional vulnerability, and we see this when he details his dream about being the catcher in the rye on page 123. He describes how he would be a catcher helping children stop their loss of innocence as they grow up and enter the adult world, which he repeatedly describes throughout the novel as something that's phony and illegitimate. The metaphor encapsulates Holden's internal conflict, and his desire to protect his innocence is ultimately an attempt to escape his own maturation. And his introspection reveals limitations through his idealism, the way that he wishes his adulthood to be, this image that he's made up within his head. Um, it emphasizes his resistance to growth rather than his acceptance of reality. So we can kind of see the way in which he compares and contrasts to Willie Loman within Death of a Salesman. Both texts use some level of introspection in order to expose the protagonist's inner thoughts and their inner limitations. However, Willie's introspection is more rooted in his denial and nostalgia that distorts his own reality, and Holden's is marked by his painful self-awareness without emotional acceptance. Both characters learn to cope with this throughout the novel, as we'll discuss later in our presentation. But together, Miller and Salinger both suggest that introspection alone is ultimately insufficient. You need acceptance, you need that sort of change within your life, without it, it entrenches individuals further into their limitations rather than freeing them from the reality that they're in.
So moving on, both Miller and Salinger use family members as symbolic embodiments of the protagonist's limitations, showing how their personal struggles become externalized through their relationships. So in Death of a Salesman, Miller uses the dialogue between Willie and Biff to dramatize Willie's limitation. So when Willie declares, quote, "that boy is going to be magnificent," he is not simply praising Biff, but he is projecting his own ambitions and kind of clinging to the fantasy of success that is never really fully achieved. So later on, Biff's confession with him saying, "I realized what a ridiculous lie my whole life had been." He kind of exposes the kind of emptiness and shallowness of Willie's dreams, and kind of the emotional charge of this exchange essentially kind of emphasizes how deeply Willie's illusions control him. That even when the truth is articulated very clearly, Willie cannot seem to internalize it, showing his limitation as a psychological and emotional barrier that prevents him from recognizing his own failures. So, similarly, in The Catcher in the Rye, Holden's vision of himself as the Catcher in the Rye functions as a symbolic script through which he kind of attempts to preserve innocence and protect himself from adulthood. So his imagined role at the edge of some, quote, crazy cliff, catching children before they fall, is described with detailed imagery and kind of highlights his obsessive need to be in control of the world around him. So this scene is intensified by Phoebe's interruption, specifically with her question to Holden, being like, "name one thing you like," kind of like punctures that fantasy that he has in his head and kind of forces Holden to confront the limitations of his own perspective. The nature of Holden's fantasy, kind of combined with Phoebe's more grounded voice, works to dramatize the tension between his desire to maintain innocence and the inevitability of change.
While both works portray similar ways in which the characters overcome their limitations, there are ways that they differ as well. More specifically, we can see this through the interactions of the secondary characters with the main characters. In Death of the Salesman, Miller constructs Linda, who is Willie's wife, as someone who prevents Willie from genuinely overcoming his limitations, and instead reinforcing his delusions until self-destruction becomes his only perceived solution. And on the other hand, in Catcher in the Rye, Salinger uses Phoebe, who is Holden's younger sister, as more of a moral guide who forces Holden to recognize his limitations and begin moving towards acceptance. So, starting with Death of the Salesman, Miller presents Willie's limitation as his inability to separate self-worth from economic success, and with Linda, Miller deliberately uses her to sustain that illusion that traps him. We can see this in the beginning of Act 2, where Willie and Linda are discussing Happy and Biff going into business and the future plans for the family. And there's a quote by Linda during this time where she says, quote, "It's changing, Willie. I can feel it changing." And this quote kind of evokes a sense of hope. And this kind of reflects how Linda invests false hope in Willie's prospects, really reinforcing his unrealistic ideals that he has placed on his son and also himself. And by doing so, it kind of prevents him from really having a meaningful confrontation with failure. And in another quote, Linda tells Willie that you're, quote, "you're well liked and the boys love you." And this kind of gives him an illusion of being like a respected and successful father. In reality, Biff, his son, who was already becoming disillusioned with his father's unattainable expectations. So she constantly reassures Willie and feeds into his need for validation. And with this repetition of assurance, Miller kind of shows how Willie's limitations are not really challenged, but instead they are affirmed, which leads to his final act of suicide, which was Willie's interpretation of overcoming his limitations. Now moving on to Catcher in the Rye. Salinger constructs Phoebe as a character who forces Holden to confront his emotional avoidance and fear of adulthood rather than escape it. In a conversation between Phoebe and Holden, Phoebe makes a blunt statement saying, quote, "You don't like anything that's happening." And this kind of reflects Salinger's deliberate use of a child's voice to articulate uncomfortable truth. And unlike Linda's protective reassurance, Phoebe's direct and honest accusation kind of forces Holden to confront his habit of pushing everything away instead of facing what is inevitable. In another quote, Phoebe tells Holden, "I said I'm not going back to school. You can do what you want to do, but I'm not going back to school, so shut up." And here Phoebe's action kind of mirrors Holden's immature mindset that he has throughout the whole novel. And she's almost like making a mockery of his unrealistic refusal to face adulthood. And by doing so, this kind of forces Holden to recognize the consequences of his avoidance, and also ultimately helps him settle on acceptance.
Continuing to look at the ways in which the choices made by J.D. Salinger and Arthur Miller respectively highlight the difference in how their main characters, Holden and Willie, overcome their limitations, we see a distinct contrast between Miller's critique of social ideology versus Salinger's idea of emotional repression within each of their novels. To explain it a bit further, we'll first look at Willie Loman. Throughout the novel, Miller often writes Willie's dialogue to be very declarative and rhetorical, emphasizing how the capitalistic values he seeks to uphold ultimately take over his way of thinking. For example, when Willie declares, "Be liked and you will never want," it shows how deeply he has internalized this idea of capitalistic success, and it leaves little to no room for internal reflection on his part. This idea is similarly reflected when he says, "The man who makes an appearance is the man who gets ahead." Miller's didactic tone in this quote further perpetuates this idea that Willie's limitations are systematic rather than self-imposed, and this idea comes to a head even when he's overcoming his limitations through his suicide, he's plagued with capitalistic logic rather than emotion itself. This idea of social ideology imposing on an individual psyche is contrasted with the idea of emotional repression in regards to Holden Caulfield. Whilst Miller writes Willie as declarative and speaking in slogans, Salinger's first-person colloquial narration sets a tone of emotional vulnerability. Throughout the novel, Holden speaks very informally and is constantly contradicting himself, exposing his psychological instability. At a point in the novel, Holden admits, I'm the most terrific liar you ever saw in your life. It's awful. Openly acknowledging his limitations in regards to his insecure and self-criticizing nature, a stark difference from Willie, who lacks emotional articulation as a whole. At another point in the novel, Holden says, it makes you feel so lonesome and depressed in regards to the surrounding New York City area, highlighting Holden's tendency to name his feelings directly. This outward form of acknowledgement itself is a step towards overcoming them, as it ultimately leads to him accepting and overcoming his limitations as a whole.